Hello, this is Rojin Mukriyan from the Amargi. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Sahar Bagehri to discuss Iran's political economy. Dr. Sahar Bagehri holds a PhD in economics from Sorbonne Paris University and is a researcher at the Institute of Interdisciplinary Research on Social Issues Laboratory. Her main areas of interest include the political economy of development and social conflict with a particular focus on the course on Iran. Sahar, thank you for accepting our invitation and welcome to the Amargi.
Thank you so much, Rojin, for having me.
Thank you. As we speak right now, the United States and Iran are holding a third round of nuclear talks in Geneva, seen by many as decisive. But before this round of talks, we also had some reports, especially coming from Iran's deputy foreign minister, stated that the country is ready to open its economy to the Americans' companies. And many already have questioned whether this would be enough to incentivize President Trump to show some mercy or leniency toward Iran. However, what I would like to know, Sahar, here is, do you think this opening to American companies signals an expansion of privatization beyond sectors controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC? Thank you.
So thank you, Rojin, for your question. It's a quite important question. But I think this proposal by Islamic Republic should primarily be understood through a geo-economic lens, meaning the use of economic tools to achieve strategic and security objectives, rather than a sign of, internal economic reform or expanded privatization beyond IRGC-controlled sectors. Actually, the idea emerged after the 12-day war with Israel and was advanced by terrorists linked to IRGC-affiliated think tanks under the formula, replacing Iran's nuclear sunset with an oil sunrise. And what does it mean in practical? It means using energy, oil, and gas production as a strategic bargaining instrument. In this proposal, Iran would scale back elements of its nuclear program in exchange for reintegration into the global network, global energy networks, with effectively American corporate participation. Under this model, so Iranian oil would effectively be embedded into US energy portfolios. In return, Iran would aim to remove the shadow of war and the US presidential waiver authority to ease sanctions and stabilize its struggling economy. So fundamentally, I think it is not a reform of economic structure or privatization in the classical terms. It is a strategic use of economic integration as a mechanism to renegotiate the balance of power within an ongoing security crisis. And in this proposal, there is where Trump becomes central. The Islamic Republic appears to believe that a transactional president figure like Donald Trump might respond positively to a high-value economic arrangement and deal. At the same time, in the calculation of the Islamic Republic, China is a key variable. According to Islamic Republics, in the program, proposal they would advance, China has been a major buyer. Actually, China is a major buyer of discounted Iranian oil. About more than 18% of Iranian oil exportation goes directly to China. So, and China is deeply embedded in the broader great power rivalry in the actual context. So here, Tehran believes that it can use oil as a leverage, not only to influence Washington, but also to push Beijing, China, to play a more active role in the confrontation among Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. So just to in the other words, the oil is a tool here to as a strategic instrument to help Iran to position itself between two superpowers. However, I think this proposal faced structural constraint. I start to explain what I mean exactly. In this calculation, we should know that Israel is not simply a regional actor. It's almost a domestic variable in US politics. Washington is demanding not only a halt on to enrichment, uranium enrichment as Iran proposed to US, but also negotiating over Iran's missile program and its regional proxy network. So which constitute red line for IRGC and for Islamic Republic, which they has already rejected this. To talk or to negotiate over these subjects. From Israel perspective, the objective is then to eliminate what is perceived as an existential threat. Particularly because during the 12-day war, Iran effectively demonstrated missile capabilities, really capable of threatening Israel directly. So the gap remains significant in this proposal and between the actors. Besides, and moreover, I think that turning back to the character of Trump and his politics, I think he tends to prioritize short-term, high-yield deals rather than complex, long-term strategic settlements. With a compressed deadline, such as 10 to 15 days, a multi-layered geoeconomic agreement that involve balancing power between United States and China becomes extremely difficult, I think, to implement. It is also important, I think, to remember that why Trump withdrew from JCPOA in 2018. One of his central criticism was that it failed to address Iran's missile program and regional activities. And in the current oil for nuclear rollback proposal of Iranian Islamic Republic, the missile issue is absent. Such an omission will almost certainly be unacceptable to Washington and Tel Aviv. But if we widen the lens further, the geoeconomic dimension becomes even clearer. The United States has strengthened its leverage over Venezuelan oil recently, effectively bringing one of its major producers under its influence, which enhances US energy security, benefits American consumer, and restricts at the same time China's access to discounted crude of Venezuela. If a conflict in the Persian Gulf disrupts up to 30% of global oil shipment, price would spike sharply. In this context, both China and US economies would harm. But as Washington already diversified its energy leverage and bring the Venezuela's petrol under its influence, it could partially offset the shock and stabilize market that would significantly increase American strategic leverage, particularly against China. So in this global context, we are seeing what we are seeing is not just economic reform and diplomacy over uranium enrichment. We are witnessing a broader competition over energy corridors, supply chains, and market stability. And I think, just if we think whether the proposal would be accepted by Trump or not, I think we should not forget that in Trump's broader national security framework, the Islamic Republic is not only a regional security issue. It's a part of a larger great power competition in which, once again, economic instruments, sanction, access to energy markets and supply chains are used as a tool of strategic powers to advance United States interests.
Okay, let me to ask a question here. We know there are huge skepticism when it comes to Iran and the US nuclear talk. We know that the gap between the two countries still remains wide. There is no agreement still on the agenda of the talks. For the US, it should also include a restriction on missile and also proxy networks. But for Iran, they are only ready to talk nuclear program. Yes, that's one side. But let's go back to our main question, which was like the Iranian deputy foreign minister, even the foreign minister Abbas Araghchi, they are like frequently repeating this, that they're ready to open their economy, and the US company also should get benefit from their resources and stuff. You also mentioned that this is a leverage, can be used by China even, that can be used to bring a balance of power between the US, China, you mentioned even Tel Aviv. But you said that this doesn't necessarily mean economic reform. So do you mean that, for the sake of argument, let's assume that they're going to reach a deal, the US and Iran, and they're going to open their economy for the US companies. Do you think this will not have any impact on the Iranian economy internally, on society, on the traditional structure of Bazaar? Do you think it has any domestic implication at all, if it happens?
Sure, of course. You know, if we imagine that Trump were to accept such a deal, at macroeconomic level, the effect on Iranian economy would be significant. In fact, it represents a positive shock to Iranian economy. In short term, particularly, the rial, for example, would likely strengthen against the dollar, and the expectation about future foreign investment would improve. The economic openness effectively and sure impact domestic economic dynamic inside Iran. But the problem is, I think that in long term, within the institutional framework of Iran's political economy, dominated by parastatal institutions, and given the structure of its power, such a transformation would face significant institutional and ideological obstacles. I mean that the cooperation between actual, companies in Iran affiliated to IRGC and United States companies would not last long time, because of some basic and fundamental conflict, ideological, geopolitical, and political conflict between both of them. Sure, economic interests are important, are a key factor in such a deal, but I think in long term, such a process would not work, because if we remember the experience of GCPOA, this is almost the same solution. Even the power balance has changed, but for a brief period, foreign investment entered the Iranian market, and there was such a cooperation between European enterprises, companies, and the Iranian market, especially in industrial sector. But at the same time, Iran was pursuing its nuclear program, and permanently we can remember well that the hardlines within the state persistently criticized integration with the West. The opportunity so was short-lived, despite the power balance that changed recently in the region. So, actually, internal debates among Khamenei, the Iranian parliament, the IRGC commanders indicate that actually it is just a geoeconomic proposal, but the underlying source of conflict between these two, geopolitical, blocks remain unsolved rather than diminishing. So in short term, sure, the effect is bad, the consequence is positive, but in long term, I don't think that it would work at long term, in long term.
Yeah, I think there's more to unpack in this question, but we leave it for another time. I would like to ask you one question on Bazaar. Like in the recent waves of protests in Iran back in December and early January, we know that the protests started in Bazaar in Tehran, and historically we know that the Bazaar and the clergy have always had very close relationship, and we know about their alliances between a mosque and the Bazaar, and they played a very important role in key events even in the modern history of Iran, including the 1906 constitutional revolution and also the 1979 revolution. Do you think that under the Islamic Republic, this relation has shifted? Has the structure of the Bazaar remained the same as it was prior to the Islamic Republic of Iran? How do you say that? Because I think it is still important. As Khamenei himself argued, Bazaar is one of the most loyal group to the establishment of the state of Iran. So how do you see that? Could you, if you can,
yeah. I think it's a very important question because it's at the same time it's allowed to shed light on some political economic transformation inside Iran under Islamic Republic rule. Yes, the Bazaar has definitely, transformed under the Islamic Republic at economic and political rules. As and to understand its role in the recent protests, we have to see this transformation as a part of a broader restructuring of the Iranian political economies. As you mentioned, historically, Bazaar played a key role in Iran. And it was not just a marketplace. Bazaar played a role of coordinating mechanism, institution, linking economy, religious institution, and society. Its relationship, particularly with Shiite clergy, was organic, as you mentioned as well. The Bazaar, the Bazaar for clergy, the Bazaar provided financial capital, funding mosque, and religious endowments, and in turn, the clergy provided, sociopolitical legitimacy to Bazaar actors. It was so clearly an exchange of capital, economic capital for symbolic and political capital. And that is why in modern Iranian history, from the constitutional revolution to 1979 revolution, the Bazaar was not only financing the protest movements, but organizing them. Particularly, turning back to the Islamic Republic state, there is a key political party that's financing Khomeini and his political project, which called Iranian Islamic Coalition Party, in Persian Hizb Mu'talifeh Islami, formed from an alliance of several Bazaar groups, emerged in support of Khomeini following the events of June 1963, and became one of the main financial and political supporters of Khomeini before the revolution and after the revolution. And particularly, after the revolution, this alliance became institutionalized. In the early years of the Islamic Republic, the Bazaar was one of the central pillars of the new regime. Merchants with long-standing clerical ties became integrated into what we can call Bunyad Bazaar Nexus. We can later talk about Bunyad more in detail, but the Bunyad was a revolutionary and is a revolutionary foundation created from confiscated assets of Pahlavi regime and affiliated enterprises and companies which work closely with clerical institutions. So there was really a nexus and alliance between Bazaar and Bunyad. The Bazaar was deeply connected to this network. Together, they formed a key economic and political basis of the regime. And during the years of Iran-Iraq war, the Islamic Republic depended really on the Bazaar, not only economically, but socially and politically. But this configuration did not remain stable, particularly during Khamenei rule. The turning point began in the 19 during the post-Iran-Iraq war reconstruction period. What was described during reconstruction era as a liberalization or privatization did not produce actually an independent, competitive private sector by merchants. Instead, many state assets were transferred to semi-state sectors, such as Bunyad, which is a conglomerate. Inside it, there are 5 institutions which are close to supreme leader institution in Iran, and other politically connected conglomerates. So, rather than strengthening this transformation and economic reform, rather than strengthening the traditional Bazaar, privatization shifted economic power toward a large institution within which has structural ties with the state. This is the first mechanism of transformation. So redistribution of assets upward from merchant networks to parastatal conglomerates. The second transformation, which is decisive to understand the actual role of Bazaar in Iran's economy, is came with the development and expansion of the role of IRGC into the Iranian economy. Over time, especially and under the sanctions, the IRGC expanded into construction, infrastructure, financial sector, insurance, energy, and even strategic trade networks. And I should, insist that sanctions did not weaken this process. In contrast, the sanctions, international sanctions, reinforced the IRGC role in Iranian economy. Because under conditions of opacity and restrictions, organizations like IRGC were structurally better positioned to manage sanctions-busting networks. So, sanctions became a selective filter. They marginalized transparent market actors like traditional merchants and empowered military-linked institutions capable of operating in closed networks under the international sanctions. So gradually, the economic center of gravity moved away from earlier Bunyad Bazaar alliance toward military-linked and parastatal conglomerates. The Bazaar sure did not appear, it exists yet, but it lost its central place within ruling coalition. Once a day, Bazaar financed Khomeini and clergy, but when they took power and they had their own revenue resource. They were no longer dependent on Bazaar. And this transformation is crucial, really. Since 18, the Islamic Republic state is no longer relies on the Bazaar. Regime stability now is tied primarily to centralized economic actors and security institutions, and not to Bazaar. And so it's about the relation between state, Islamic Republic state, and the Bazaar. The alliance is no longer like before. There is great transformation. IRGC replaced its role. But inside it, as you asked in your question, sure, Bazaar, traditional Bazaar as well, and Bazaar as an coordinating institution in Iran's economy transformed at the same time. So alongside, actually, there exists yet for the traditional sector in Bazaar, but at the same time, we have a modern commercial layer which emerged. And we have chain stores, we have mall, we have online trades, we have millions of registered guild units. Large-scale traders, so particularly who benefited from rents, may maintain ties with power with the state, but the main body, small retailers and wholesalers, is structurally exposed to macroeconomic instability. And this is where the protest dynamics change, you know. If we look at the history of the Bazaar protests and movements in Iran, there is a significant change. Before 2012, Bazaar protests were largely reaction to taxation and the state policies of, you know, increasing a tax on the Bazaar. But since 2012, the dynamic and the reason behind protests changed significantly because of sanctions and dollarization of the Iranian economy, which altered the train of the, you know, contestation and economic grievances. The weakening of the real meant it could no longer function as a reliable source of store of value for Iranian. And instead, economic actors turned to dollar to preserve their capital, value of their capital. So when the real collapsed in October 2012, protests moved beyond narrow guild demands. They entered streets and they became political. By 2018, protest center shifted to modern commercial complex, showing that the modern exchange rate dependent Bazaar had become a decisive actor in Iranian economy. So meanwhile, in the Iranian policy of, you know, particularly financial policy and budget policy, we have preferential currency allocation each time facing, you know, currency crisis in Iran, in which there is a tax exemption for parastatal institution and rent-seeking network tied to IRGC, which the divide yet once again between the privileged conglomerates and ordinary merchants. So when Bazaar merchants close their shops today and recently, this is historically significant. It is not just, it does not simply reflect that we are in the situation of economic hardship, but the erosion of the regime's original social and economic alliance with Bazaar. The Bazaar once was a foundational partner in the Republic state, now operates from a structurally marginalized position within the transformed political economy under the Islamic Republic. And in this sense, I think that the changing role of Bazaar illustrate a deeper shift in the structure of power itself inside Iran, from a revolutionary coalition anchored in the Bunyad Bazaar nexus during Iran-Iraq war to a centralized system dominated by parastatal and military-linked institutions which marginalized traditional Bazaar.
Thank you so much, Sahar, for that. It is very complicated. It's very complicated political economy. It is hard to understand it, but at the same time, I think it provides a good explanation why it is not a surprise that we shouldn't expect any coup d'etat in Iran. With the way that you explained, we see that how IRGC basically entangle itself within every segment of this state, within economy, with politics, with military. But let's put that aside for now and talk about the recent wave of protest. Of course, this wave of the protest back in December and early January had its own distinctive features. And one of these distinctive feature was that it was so quick in encompassing and bringing and including all urban or major metropolitan cities like Shiraz. Tehran itself was at the center, Qom, Mashhad. What was the reason? Do you think the economic factors was the main driver behind this urban unrest, or it was something more than this? Because we usually don't see such a urban unrest, especially in Mashhad, in Qom.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, this was the recent wave of protests was quite, thought-provoking, and for everyone, inside Bazaar, inside Iranian economic, and for those who think about, social movements and protests in Iran. As you said in your question, yes, I do think economic factors are central to this wave of urban unrest, but not in the narrow sense that people are simply reacting to inflation or to the falling to currency crisis. I think what we are seeing is a structural economic crisis that people experience as deeply political. And I think we can, just to make it clear, I will try to make the dynamic, clear from within a concrete example of daily life of the people and what they chanting in the street. But let's start today in Iran. Many people no longer see inflation, the collapse of the dollar, or the budget deficit as a technical economic problems. They see them as the outcome of how power works in the country and political economy is constructed under the actual regime. Particularly since the protests that began in 2017, we have seen a clear shift. Ordinary people increasingly connect their economic hardship to the broader structure of the Islamic Republic. When, for people, when your daily life is shaped by repeated currency shocks, declining purchasing power, and job insecurity, it becomes obvious that it is not just mismanagement. It reflects political priorities and political choices of the state for the people. That's why economic grievances since 2017 quickly turn into broader anti-system, anti-regime demands. And to understand this, we need to look once again at the structure of the Iranian political economy to see why the people understand and analyze economic crisis deeply political. After the revolution, after the 1979 revolution, so the economy was built on oil-funded system that combined redistribution with strong state control over assets, public and private assets. But from the 19 onwards, privatization, as I mentioned in the earlier question, and market reform gradually transformed this system. And instead of, once again, creating a productive private sector, these reforms transformed public assets into the hands of parastatal institutions, religious foundations, and military-linked organizations, and politically connected conglomerates, something which people clearly and directly critics in their during the protest and in their public attacking and debates. We see these critics clearly. So for people, and to refer to the words used by people, what emerged now is a kind of husulati economy, which means private, between private sector and public or state sector, neither fully state nor private, but organized through a network of political power. So over the time, this created, now, if once a day we have the Bunyad Bazaar alliance, now we have military Bunyad complex that dominated strategic sectors and controlled a large share of economic resource in Iran. A crucial feature of this system is the way public resources are allocated, which impact the daily life of the people in Iran. Significant parts of the state budget and oil revenue are directed toward parastatal institutions and security organizations that are essential for regime survival, for financing regime, regional, political projects, and its nuclear program, all close to the, parastatal institutions. So, economic decline by people is experienced not only through inflation, but also through deteriorating public services in health, in education, and social protection. And fiscal policy itself, if I go further, reflects political priorities of the regime criticized by the people. Maintaining the system comes before protecting living standards of the people. So, and in these mechanisms, in this process, the international sanctions reinforce this pressure on the people. But many people inside Iran and because of sanctions and international sanctions, people see economic isolation as a result of the regime's geopolitical strategy and regional ambitions. And there is a growing perception that the cost of geopolitical confrontation of the regime are being paid by the ordinary citizen. So what is economic is really perceived and analyzed as political by the people. And people, openly criticize the fact that resources are spent on regional influence and military involvement, while their own living conditions, damaged during all these years. So sanctions for the people are not simply an external shocks, in contrast that many pro-Islamic Republic analysts talk about it. No, sanction by the people, they are understood as, and I think it's real, it's correct, they are understood as the consequence of political choices and positioning of the Islamic Republic. This strengthens the connection connection people make between economic hardship and the political system itself. In this dynamic, and quite relevant to the recent protests, which is the currency crisis, show once again how political economy works in practice within this political economy, which is dominated by parastatal institution and double. We are faced with we have two types of state in the Iranian economy. Each of them have its specific public budget, and which impact clearly all the aspect of the economic life of the people in Iran. To see how the state and the government manage currency crisis, I can explain in this way that during the periods of high oil revenue and or temporary sanction relief, such as during the GCPOA agreement, the state stabilized prices by expanding imports and keeping the exchange rate artificially strong. But this solution creates dependence on oil income and foreign currency. So when revenue falls, when Trump withdraw from GCPOA agreement and income when state revenue falls and sanction tighten, the real collapse. And people since the beginning of the regime until now experienced 9 currency shocks. At that point, politically connected, importers and semi-state companies continue to receive privileged access to subsidized dollars, while ordinary people and households face inflation and austerity. And multiple exchange rate in this setting turns economic policy into a mechanism for redistributing oil rents toward regime-aligned networks. So currency collapse and inflation are not perceived and actually by people and actually are not random shocks. They are predictable outcomes of the system. And at the same time, there's an important point that I should mention is the neoliberal restructurings in the labor market and social sector by the states, which increase the inequality and poverty. Labor deregulation has transformed employment conditions severely in Iran. Actually, Trump temporary contract increased, just imagine that, from about 10% of jobs in 19 to roughly 97% by 2021. This is huge. It impacts the daily life of the people, how they can buy, house, car, how they can invest on their future with temporary contracts. And stable employment has largely disappeared under the neoliberal politics of the regime. Which is quite, which affect the young graduates between, the age of 15 and 13, who make a large share of Iranian population. Cuts of food and energy subsidies, inflation and currency, have pushed many households toward poverty, especially rural migrants and urban poor. So inequality has widened sharply. Just to give you some statistics, it might be helpful that the richest 10% now in Iran earn roughly 15 times more than the poorest 10% in the country. That is why the poor periphery of the big cities in Iran and the centers actively participate in the protests, including in Kurdistan as well. So, and just to give you another, statistics about the actual situation of the country, economic situation of the country, at the end of 2024, more than 31% of the population was living below the extreme poverty line, which is catastrophic, actually. So this helps explain why unrest spread across major urban centers. Both working class and middle class groups in Iran experienced declining economic security, and each wave of protest since 2017 has strengthened the connection people make between economic hardship and the structure of the power itself in Iran. The current protests continue this trajectory. Economic shocks are hitting the population that already understand that the institute and analyze the institutional origins of this economic hardship. So economic factors are, as you said, absolutely central to the unrest, but the key point is that the economic crisis in Iran is itself political. People are not only protesting inflation or unemployment, they are reacting to an economic system in which resources and opportunity, stability and opportunity are distributed through networks of power, parastatal institutions, and geopolitical priorities.
Thank you so much. I think the Iranian regime so far was only successful in utilizing biopolitics to control or to create a very fertile condition for a perpetual fair life for the society. We appreciate Dr. Sahar Bagehri, your valuable and insightful thought, and we thank you again for putting time and sharing your insights on Iranian political economy with us. Thank you, and I think we leave it here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rojin, for your invitation.